My husband demanded I apologize to his female best friend because my honesty hurt her feelings. When I refused, he shouted in anger, "Apologize or I'll divorce you." I agreed. I went to her house, looked her in the eye, and in front of her husband, I said something that made them both understand why women like me never bow for truth. "Apologize to Scarlett or I'll divorce you." My husband Mason stood in our living room with his arms crossed, delivering that ultimatum like he was negotiating a business deal instead of threatening to end our 5-year marriage. His face was set in that expression I'd come to know too well over the past months. The one that said I was being unreasonable, jealous, impossible to deal with. The one that made me question my own sanity even when I knew I was right. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing stories about truth and standing up for yourself. If you believe that honesty matters more than keeping peace at any cost, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. I stared at him, this man I'd promised to love and cherish, and realized I didn't recognize him anymore. Or maybe I'd never really known him at all. Because the Mason I thought I married wouldn't demand I apologize to his female best friend for the crime of noticing their inappropriate relationship. The Mason I thought I married wouldn't gaslight me into thinking I was the problem when his emotional affair with Scarlett Pierce had been happening right under my nose for years. "You want me to apologize to her?" I heard my own voice, calmer than I felt inside. "For what exactly?" "For treating her with suspicion and coldness since the day you met her. For making her feel unwelcome in our lives. For being so jealous that you can't accept I have a meaningful friendship outside our marriage." Mason's voice rose with each accusation, like he was the victim here. "Scarlett's been nothing but kind to you, and you've hurt her feelings with your constant attitude. She deserves an apology, and if you can't give her that, then I don't know if I can stay in this marriage." Something shifted inside me in that moment. Not heartbreak exactly, though that would come later. What I felt was clarity, cold and sharp as a blade. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to when I still believed in the life Mason and I were building together. I'm Aria Montgomery, and for 5 years I genuinely thought I had a solid marriage. We met at a summer barbecue thrown by mutual friends on one of those perfect July afternoons where everything felt possible. Mason was standing by the drink cooler when I walked up, and he looked at me with this genuine smile that made me forget I was supposed to play it cool. We talked for 3 hours straight that day, sitting on the back porch steps while the party continued around us. He listened when I talked about my work as a graphic designer. He asked thoughtful questions about my creative process. He told me about managing operations at a mid-sized logistics company with real enthusiasm, not the fake interest some men use as a placeholder until they can talk about themselves again. What got me was how he paid attention to details. On our first real date, he remembered I took my coffee with just a splash of cream and no sugar. He surprised me with bookstore dates because I'd mentioned loving the smell of new books and the quiet atmosphere. He made me feel seen in ways I hadn't experienced before, like he was actually interested in who I was rather than who he wanted me to be. Our wedding came 2 years later. We kept it small and meaningful, held in a garden venue with string lights wrapped around old oak trees and wildflowers in mason jars on every table. We invited only close family and friends, the kind of intimate ceremony where you actually recognize everyone there and can have real conversations instead of working a receiving line. I wore a simple ivory dress I'd found at a boutique downtown. Mason cried during his vows. My mother pulled me aside during the reception and told me she'd never seen me look happier. We settled into our 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood where kids still rode bikes on the sidewalks and neighbors knew each other's names. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, which gave me flexibility to manage my own schedule. Mason commuted downtown to his logistics company every morning at 7 and came home around 6 most evenings. We split bills fairly down the middle. We cooked together on weekends, experimenting with new recipes and laughing when things went wrong. We talked about buying a house someday, maybe having kids, definitely traveling more once we'd saved enough. Life felt stable, predictable, comfortable in all the ways I'd been taught to value. I thought I knew exactly who I'd married and what our future would look like. Looking back now, I realize I was living in a carefully constructed illusion where I only saw what Mason wanted me to see. The illusion started cracking about 6 months into our marriage when Mason came home from work one evening with visible excitement radiating off him. He sat me down on our couch and told me his college best friend Scarlett was moving back to town after years working pharmaceutical sales in another state. He described her with the kind of nostalgic warmth that initially seemed innocent, the way anyone talks about friends who shaped their younger years. Scarlett was brilliant, he said. One of those naturally charismatic people who could sell anything to anyone and make them feel grateful for the opportunity. She'd been his closest friend during their last 2 years of college, part of a tight group that had stayed up late solving the world's problems and making promises about staying connected forever the way 20-year-olds do. I was genuinely happy for Mason. Everyone needs good friends, especially the kind who knew you before you became the person you are now. I had my own college friends scattered across different states, people I texted regularly and visited when possible. Having Scarlett nearby would be good for him, I thought. He'd been mentioning feeling disconnected from old friends lately, missing the easy camaraderie of people who shared history with him. When I finally met Scarlett at a dinner Mason organized at a restaurant downtown, she was exactly as he'd described. Polished and confident in the way pharmaceutical sales representatives learn to be, professionally dressed even for a casual Friday evening, with highlighted hair styled in loose waves and jewelry that spoke to her success without being ostentatious. She had that practiced smile that comes from years of client meetings, warm but slightly impersonal, the kind that makes you feel welcomed but not necessarily seen. She was attractive in a carefully maintained way, the kind of woman who clearly invested time and money in her appearance as part of her professional brand. What struck me immediately was how Scarlett and Mason fell into an easy rhythm within minutes of sitting down. They laughed about professors I'd never met, reminisced about road trips I hadn't been part of, finished each other's sentences in ways that demonstrated deep familiarity. I sat there smiling and nodding, trying to participate when the conversation briefly turned to include me, but mostly feeling like an observer watching a reunion I wasn't part of. It wasn't hostile or deliberately exclusionary. It was just that their shared history created a language I didn't speak, references I didn't understand, inside jokes that required lengthy explanations to make sense to an outsider. Scarlett's husband Elijah was there too, a quiet man who worked as an accountant and seemed equally peripheral to the conversation. He caught my eye at one point while Mason and Scarlett were laughing about something from their sophomore year, and we shared a brief look that I didn't fully understand then but would come to recognize later as mutual acknowledgement of our secondary status. The first small boundary violation happened so subtly I almost didn't notice it. A few weeks after that initial dinner, Scarlett started texting Mason during our date nights. The first time we were at a movie theater waiting for the previews to start when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, typed a quick response, then put it away with an apologetic smile. 5 minutes later it buzzed again. Then again. By the time the actual movie started, Mason had exchanged a dozen messages with Scarlett about some work presentation she was nervous about. He apologized each time, promised to put the phone away, but it kept pulling his attention like a magnetic force he couldn't fully resist. This pattern repeated itself over the following months. Dinner dates interrupted by texts about difficult clients. Weekend mornings disrupted by phone calls about Scarlett's marriage problems with Elijah. Late evenings when Mason would be typing responses to messages while we sat on the couch supposedly watching television together. Each time I gently suggested maybe he could text her back later, Mason would look at me with barely concealed disappointment, as if I was failing some fundamental test of understanding and compassion. Then came the spare key incident. Mason gave Scarlett a key to our apartment for emergencies without discussing it with me first. I found out when I came out of my home office one Tuesday afternoon to find Scarlett sitting on our couch with her shoes off, completely at home in my space while Mason made her coffee. She needed to borrow our Wi-Fi for a client call, she explained cheerfully because hers had gone down again. Again, as if this was a recurring pattern I should have known about. I stood there in my own living room feeling like an intruder while Scarlett chatted with Mason about her sales territory and commission structures. When she finally left an hour later, I asked Mason if maybe we could establish some boundaries about the spare key, suggest that Scarlett text before coming over so we weren't caught off guard. Mason's response was immediate and defensive. Scarlett was going through a difficult transition, he explained with exaggerated patience. New city, struggling marriage, high-pressure job. Real friends showed up for each other without conditions or restrictions. Was I really going to be the kind of person who put convenience over compassion? That conversation became a template for dozens more over the following months. Every time I tried to establish a boundary, Mason reframed it as me being unwelcoming, jealous, unable to handle his having close friendships outside our marriage. I started second-guessing my own instincts, wondering if I was being possessive or unreasonable. Maybe this was what mature adult friendships looked like and I was just too insecure to handle it. Our 5th anniversary arrived on a Tuesday in late September. I'd made reservations 2 months in advance at Meridian, an elegant restaurant downtown known for its intimate atmosphere and menu that changed seasonally. I wore the emerald dress Mason had complimented years ago on one of our early dates, the one he'd said made my eyes look like sea glass. I'd planned the entire evening carefully. Dinner, then a walk along the Riverwalk where we'd had one of our first real conversations, then home where I had a gift waiting, a leather-bound photo album I'd commissioned documenting our relationship from that initial barbecue through our wedding and into our married life. We made it halfway through our appetizers before Mason's phone started buzzing incessantly. Once, twice, 5 times in rapid succession. Each notification fractured his attention a little more until he was barely present, his eyes glued to the screen while I sat across from him watching myself become invisible in real time. That's when I said those words. "Mason, it's our anniversary." And that's when he looked up with genuine confusion and said Scarlett was having a crisis, that he was just letting her know she wasn't alone. But I was alone. Sitting across from my husband at an expensive restaurant on what should have been one of the most important nights of our year while he provided emotional support to another woman. The irony was suffocating, bitter in my mouth mixing with food I could barely swallow. That night, lying in bed while Mason slept peacefully beside me, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding for months. My marriage had 3 people in it and I was the least important one. 3 months passed after that anniversary dinner at Meridian. 3 months of me trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that Mason's relationship with Scarlett was just an unusually close friendship, that my discomfort was my own issue to work through. 3 months of swallowing my instincts and forcing smiles while Scarlett continued using her spare key to drop by unannounced and Mason continued prioritizing her texts over our conversations. Then my laptop died on a Wednesday morning in early December, right in the middle of a critical client project. The screen went black without warning while I was working on a design presentation for a major client, the kind that could lead to a long-term contract if I delivered something impressive. I tried restarting it multiple times, holding down different key combinations, even unplugging it and removing the battery. Nothing worked. The deadline was end of business day, which gave me roughly 6 hours to finish the presentation and submit it. Panic set in immediately. I needed access to my work files that were stored in the cloud and I needed it fast. Mason's laptop sat in his home office where he'd left it that morning before heading downtown to work. He told me dozens of times I could use it if I ever needed to, that we didn't have secrets from each other, that what was his was mine. I grabbed it without hesitation, powered it up and logged into my cloud storage account through his browser. The presentation files loaded quickly, and I dove back into work mode, racing against the clock to finish the complex layout I'd been building. About an hour in, I realized I needed to reference our tax documents from last year to verify some business expense categories I was illustrating for the client. Mason kept all our financial documents organized in folders on his laptop since he handled most of our administrative paperwork. I opened his file explorer and navigated to where he usually kept our shared documents. That's when I saw it, buried among work files and random downloads in a way that suggested it was deliberately hidden but not well enough. A folder labeled Personal, Private. Something about those 2 words together made my stomach clench with instinct before my conscious mind could process why. Mason and I didn't keep secrets from each other. We'd always operated on a foundation of openness and honesty, or at least that's what I'd believed. So why would he need a folder marked private on a laptop he'd told me I could use freely? My hands trembled slightly as I moved the cursor over the folder. Part of me knew I should close the laptop and ask Mason about it directly when he got home. Part of me hoped desperately that I'd find something innocent inside, maybe surprise birthday planning or sensitive work documents he wasn't supposed to share. I clicked it open. The folder contained hundreds of files. Photos, screenshots, documents spanning back 3 years according to the date stamps. My eyes tried to make sense of what I was seeing, my brain working to categorize and understand before the emotional impact could hit. Mason and Scarlett sitting across from each other at restaurant tables I didn't recognize, leaning in close in conversation that looked far more intimate than casual friendship. Candid shots of Scarlett laughing at something off camera, her face glowing with genuine joy. Selfies of the 2 of them together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling like they shared something precious and private. And screenshots, dozens and dozens of screenshots of text message conversations between them. I clicked on the first screenshot with hands that had gone numb. The timestamp showed 2 a.m. from 6 months ago. Scarlett had written a long paragraph about feeling lost in her marriage to Elijah, about wondering if she'd made the right choices in her life, about missing the connection she used to feel with people who really understood her. Mason's response was equally long, validating every feeling she'd expressed, sharing his own thoughts about paths not taken and connections that transcend normal friendship boundaries. I opened another screenshot. This one from a year ago late at night again. Scarlett writing about how she couldn't sleep because she kept thinking about different versions of her life, different choices she could have made. Mason responding with understanding and his own confessions about wondering what if, about having regrets he couldn't fully articulate to most people. My client deadline was completely forgotten now. I sat frozen at Mason's desk, clicking through screenshot after screenshot, watching a hidden relationship unfold in documented detail. These weren't casual friend check-ins about weekend plans or work advice. These were emotional confessions, intimate late-night conversations where two people shared their deepest feelings and regrets and longings. Then I found the message that would replay in my mind for months afterward, burned into my memory with the precision of acid-etching glass. Scarlett had sent it at 2:17 a.m. about 8 months ago, right around the time Mason had started seeming distant and preoccupied at home. The message read, "Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if we'd gotten together instead of just staying friends back in college. Do you ever think about that?" Mason's response came just 3 minutes later, suggesting he'd been awake and waiting for her message, or that he'd been thinking about her at 2 a.m. instead of sleeping next to his wife. More than I probably should. But we made our choices. Doesn't mean I don't value what we have now. I read those words 3 times. 4 times. 5 times, hoping each time that they would somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating, something that could be explained away as innocent friendship. But the meaning was crystal clear. My husband had feelings for Scarlett that went far beyond friendship. He'd been thinking about alternative versions of his life where they were together instead of just friends. And he valued what they currently had, whatever that was, enough to maintain it through years of secret communication. The worst part was the timestamp. 2:20 a.m. While I'd been sleeping in our bed, probably worried about some work project or household task, Mason had been awake engaging in emotional intimacy with another woman, discussing hypothetical romantic relationships they could have had together. I couldn't stop myself from digging deeper now. The Pandora's box was open and I needed to see everything inside no matter how much it would hurt. I closed the screenshots folder and opened our joint credit card statements through the online banking portal Mason kept bookmarked on his browser. I started searching for patterns, cross-referencing dates and locations. Every Tuesday afternoon for the past 2 years, a charge appeared at Riverbend Cafe, an upscale bistro downtown that Mason had never once mentioned or suggested we visit together. The amounts were consistently between $50 and $70, the kind of total you'd see for 2 people having a nice lunch with drinks and appetizers. Far more than Mason would typically spend on a casual meal. I opened Mason's digital calendar, which he kept synced across his devices. There it was, plain as day once I knew to look for it. Every Tuesday at noon, a recurring appointment simply labeled lunch meeting with no other details, no client names, no location specified. Just a vague 2-hour block that had been on his calendar for years. I compared the dates of the Riverbend Cafe charges with the photos in his hidden folder. They matched perfectly. The photos of Mason and Scarlett at restaurant tables had been taken at those Tuesday lunches. While I'd been at home working on freelance design projects, eating leftovers at my desk and assuming my husband was grabbing a quick bite between meetings, he'd been having weekly secret lunch dates with Scarlett. Dates that required him to block off 2 full hours, that involved spending significant money, that were important enough to maintain as a pattern for years. This wasn't occasional friendly catch-ups when schedules aligned. This was deliberate, sustained, carefully planned deception. Mason had been building a parallel emotional life with Scarlett, complete with standing dates and intimate late-night conversations and shared secrets, all while coming home to me and acting like everything was normal. I sat at that desk for 2 hours straight, my client presentation completely abandoned as the deadline passed unnoticed. I read through every screenshot I could find. I documented every suspicious charge on our credit card. I looked at every photo, studying their body language and facial expressions, seeing things I'd missed before when I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. The evidence wasn't ambiguous or open to interpretation. It wasn't a few questionable texts that could be explained as friendship being misconstrued. This was years of documented emotional intimacy, financial proof of secret meetings, photographic evidence of a relationship that crossed every boundary a married person should respect. What made everything worse was the sudden clarity about how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. Every single time over the past months when I'd expressed discomfort about Scarlett's constant presence in our lives, Mason had made me feel like the problem. He'd called me jealous, possessive, insecure, unable to handle mature adult friendships. He'd positioned himself as the patient, reasonable partner trying to help his wife work through her unfounded suspicions. He'd made me question my own instincts and perceptions until I'd started believing that my discomfort was a personal failing I needed to overcome. But my instincts had been screaming truth the entire time. Every uncomfortable feeling, every moment of suspicion, every time I'd felt like the third wheel in my own marriage, all of it had been accurate perception of a reality Mason was actively hiding from me while gaslighting me into thinking I was imagining problems that didn't exist. I finally understood why Mason defended Scarlett so fiercely whenever I tried to set boundaries. Why he prioritized her texts and calls over our time together. Why he gave her a spare key to our apartment without asking me first. Why he'd looked at me with disappointment and frustration whenever I suggested maybe their friendship had unhealthy dynamics. Because in Mason's mind I wasn't his priority. Scarlett was. I was the obligation, the legal wife, the person he came home to out of commitment rather than choice. Scarlett was the person he thought about at 2 a.m, the person he carved out special time for every single week, the person he shared his deepest feelings and regrets with. I had become the third wheel in my own marriage, and the evidence proving it was spread across Mason's laptop screen in undeniable detail. I sat at Mason's desk staring at the evidence of his betrayal until the afternoon light shifted and shadows stretched across the room. My client deadline had passed hours ago. My phone had buzzed multiple times with messages I didn't read. None of it mattered anymore compared to the wreckage of my marriage spread across the laptop screen in front of me. Eventually I forced myself to move. I found a USB drive in the desk drawer and methodically copied everything. Every photo of Mason and Scarlett at those Tuesday lunches. Every screenshot of their late-night conversations about roads not taken and connections that transcended boundaries. Every credit card statement showing the pattern of secret meetings spanning years. I organized it all into folders with clear labels and dates, building a case like a lawyer preparing for trial. When I finished, I sat back and waited for something to happen inside me. I expected tears or rage or the kind of emotional collapse you see in movies when someone's world falls apart. Instead, I felt a strange calm clarity, the kind that comes after shock wears off completely and you realize you're standing in wreckage that can't be rebuilt. There was almost relief in it, knowing I hadn't been crazy or paranoid, that my instincts had been right all along. I looked at the clock. 3:45. Mason would be home around 6:30 like always, walking through the door with his briefcase and work stress written across his face, expecting dinner and normal evening conversation. I decided to give him exactly that, at least at first. I wanted to see if he could sit across from me and pretend everything was fine, knowing what he'd been hiding. I went to the kitchen and started preparing dinner. Chicken with roasted vegetables, one of Mason's favorites. I set the table with our regular dishes, not the nice ones we saved for special occasions. I even put on background music, a playlist we both liked, creating the illusion of normalcy in our apartment that suddenly felt like a stage set rather than a home. Mason walked through the door at 6:28, right on schedule. He looked tired, his tie loosened and his hair slightly messed from running his hands through it the way he did when work frustrated him. He smiled when he saw me in the kitchen, set down his briefcase and came over to kiss my cheek like he had thousands of times before. "Something smells good," he said, already heading toward our bedroom to change into comfortable clothes. "Rough day with that client presentation?" My laptop had crashed this morning a lifetime ago. He didn't know I'd spent the day discovering his emotional affair instead of working. "You could say that," I replied, my voice steady. I let him decompress for exactly 15 minutes. Long enough for him to change into sweatpants and a t-shirt, pour himself a glass of red wine from the bottle we kept on the counter, and settle into his usual spot on the couch with his phone. I watched him scroll through messages, probably texting Scarlett about his day, completely oblivious to what was coming. Then I walked over with his laptop, already opened to that hidden folder with its hundreds of incriminating files. I sat down in the armchair across from him, the coffee table between us like a barrier or maybe a protective moat. I turned the screen so he could see it clearly and asked the simplest question I could formulate. "What is this?" Mason looked up from his phone, confusion crossing his face as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Then I watched recognition hit him. His eyes widened slightly. His mouth opened as if to speak but no words came out. For maybe 3 seconds, panic flashed across his features, raw and unguarded. Then it was gone, replaced by something harder. His expression shifted into defensiveness so quickly I almost missed the transition. "You went through my private files?" His voice rose with immediate indignation, as if I were the one who had committed some unforgivable violation. "Arya, what the hell? Those are my personal things. You had no right to go snooping through my laptop." The audacity of it stunned me for a moment. He wasn't denying what was in the folder. He wasn't apologizing or trying to explain. His first instinct was to make me the villain for discovering his betrayal. "I was using your laptop because mine crashed during a work deadline," I said, keeping my voice calm and level. "I needed to access our tax documents and I found a folder labeled private that contained evidence of a years-long emotional affair with Scarlett. So yes, I looked at it. And now I'm asking you to explain it." Mason set down his wine glass with more force than necessary. "There's nothing to explain. You're misinterpreting a friendship because you've never been able to handle me being close with Scarlett. This is exactly the kind of jealous behavior I've been trying to be patient with for months." I felt something cold settle in my chest. He was actually going to try to gaslight me while the evidence sat between us on his laptop screen. "Mason, I read the text messages. I saw the photos from your secret Tuesday lunch dates. I found the credit card charges at Riverbend Cafe every single week for 2 years. This isn't me misinterpreting friendship. This is you having an emotional affair and lying about it." "It's not an affair." Mason stood up, pacing now, his voice taking on that exasperated tone he used when explaining something he thought should be obvious. "Scarlett and I are close friends. We have been since college. Yes, we talk about deep things. Yes, we meet for lunch regularly. That's what real friendship looks like, Arya. Deep connection, emotional honesty, mutual support. Just because you don't have friendships like that doesn't mean they're inappropriate." Every sentence was a carefully constructed deflection, reframing his betrayal as my inadequacy. I'd heard these tactics before but never so blatantly, never while hard evidence sat between us proving he was lying. "She texted you at 2 in the morning asking if you ever thought about what life would have been like if you'd gotten together instead of staying friends," I said, my voice harder now. "You responded that you thought about it more than you probably should. That's not friendship, Mason. That's emotional infidelity. You're twisting things." He stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. "Taking private conversations out of context and building some narrative in your head because you're insecure about my friendships. Scarlett and I talk about hypothetical scenarios sometimes. That doesn't mean anything inappropriate is happening." The argument continued for 2 hours, circling around the same points with Mason deflecting and reframing every piece of evidence I presented. He had an explanation for everything. The late-night texts were just friends supporting each other through difficult times. The secret lunch dates were regular catch-ups he didn't mention because he knew I'd react badly. The intimate conversations were normal for people who had history and deep understanding of each other. Every time I pointed out how his behavior had crossed boundaries, he countered that I was the one with the problem. I was too jealous to handle mature adult friendships. Too possessive to accept that he had meaningful connections outside our marriage. Too insecure to trust that men and women could be close without it being romantic. I was exhausted from defending reality against his revised version of it. My head hurt from the circular logic and constant deflection. But I kept pushing because I needed to hear him acknowledge the truth, needed him to stop lying and actually take responsibility for what he'd done. That's when Mason delivered the statement that would seal the fate of our marriage. He stood in the middle of our living room, his arms crossed and his jaw set with determination. His voice took on that patronizing tone I'd come to recognize over the past months, the one that suggested he was the adult dealing with a difficult child. "If anything, Arya, you owe Scarlett an apology." The words hung in the air between us. I stared at him, genuinely shocked into silence. She has been nothing but kind to you over the years, Mason continued, warming to his argument now. She's tried to include you, tried to be friendly, and you've treated her with suspicion and coldness since the day you met her. She knows you don't like her. She's told me it hurts her feelings how you act around her, how you always try to limit our friendship. He was actually doing this. He was actually trying to make his emotional affair partner into the victim and me into the aggressor who needed to apologize. You want me to apologize to her? I heard my own voice, oddly calm despite the rage building inside me. For what exactly? For noticing that my husband was having an emotional affair? For being uncomfortable with inappropriate boundaries? For trusting my instincts when you've spent months trying to convince me they were wrong? For being jealous and possessive and unable to handle me having close friendships? Mason's voice rose with each word. For making Scarlett feel unwelcome and judged when she's done nothing wrong. She deserves an apology, and if you can't give her that, then I seriously need to reconsider this marriage. The room went absolutely silent after those words. Even the background music seemed to fade away. Mason stood there with his arms crossed and his expression set, clearly believing he held all the power in this moment. He thought he was calling my bluff, forcing me to choose between my pride and my marriage, making me bend to his will the way he'd been doing for months with smaller things. He had no idea what he'd just done. Something shifted inside me in that silence, cold and clear and absolutely certain. I looked at my husband, this man who was demanding I apologize to his emotional affair partner for the crime of noticing their inappropriate relationship, and realized he'd just handed me the perfect weapon. If Mason wanted an apology, he would get one. Just not the kind he was expecting. I let the silence stretch a bit longer, watching him stand there in his self-righteous certainty. Then I spoke in a voice much calmer than I felt inside. Fine. Mason's expression shifted to surprise. He'd clearly expected more argument. I'll apologize to Scarlett, I continued, my tone completely reasonable. But let's do it properly. At her house with Elijah there too. If I'm going to apologize for hurting her feelings, I want to do it right, in front of both of our spouses so everyone can hear what I have to say. Mason's face lit up with relief and something that looked disturbingly like triumph. He actually smiled, believing he'd won, that he'd successfully broken me into compliance and established Scarlett's permanent priority in his life. Really? You'll do that? His voice was eager now, pleased with himself. Absolutely, I said. Schedule it for this Saturday evening. I want to make sure everyone's there. I'll prepare what I want to say. Mason nodded enthusiastically, already pulling out his phone to text Scarlett about arrangements. I watched him type, watched his face relax for the first time all evening, and felt absolutely nothing but cold clarity. He had no idea what I was actually planning. No comprehension that he'd just arranged the perfect stage for me to detonate the truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Mason spent the rest of that evening texting Scarlett about the arrangements, his face glowing with satisfaction every time she responded. I watched him from across the room, this man who believed he'd just won some significant victory, and felt nothing but cold determination settling deeper into my bones. The next morning, Thursday, I woke up with absolute clarity about what needed to happen before Saturday evening. Mason left for work at his usual time, kissing my forehead and reminding me to think about what I wanted to say in my apology. The moment his car pulled out of our parking lot, I returned to his laptop. I spent 3 hours methodically documenting everything. I took detailed screenshots of every damaging conversation, organizing them chronologically in a way that showed clear progression. The early messages from 3 years ago were friendly enough, the kind of text you might exchange with any close friend. But then they shifted gradually into something deeper, more intimate, crossing boundaries in increments small enough that maybe Mason had convinced himself each individual step was innocent. By the second year, Scarlett was texting him late at night about feeling disconnected from Elijah, about missing the kind of emotional intimacy she used to have with people who really understood her. Mason responded with paragraphs validating every feeling, sharing his own struggles with feeling truly seen and appreciated. They started using pet names for each other. Started saying things like, "You always know exactly what I need to hear," and "I don't know what I'd do without you in my life." I organized all of it into folders labeled by year and month, creating a timeline that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Then I compiled the financial evidence, pulling our joint credit card statements and highlighting every Tuesday lunch charge at Riverbend Cafe for the past 2 years. I calculated the total amount Mason had spent on those secret lunches. Over $7,000 on meals with another woman while we'd been supposedly saving for a house down payment. Then I found something that made my stomach turn in a different way. Buried in Mason's email inbox were receipts for gifts he'd purchased for Scarlett. A designer silk scarf from Nordstrom for her birthday last year, $250. A bottle of expensive French wine for her promotion 6 months ago, $180. Flowers delivered to her pharmaceutical sales office when she closed a major deal, $75 with a card that read, "Always knew you could do it. So proud of you." These weren't casual friend gestures. These were the kinds of gifts you bought for someone you were romantically involved with, someone whose achievements and milestones mattered deeply to you. The card messages were affectionate in a way that crossed every professional and platonic boundary. I printed everything, created digital backups in 3 separate cloud storage accounts that Mason didn't have access to, and even saved copies to 2 different USB drives that I hid in separate locations. I wasn't taking any chances that he might delete or manipulate evidence before Saturday's confrontation. By Thursday afternoon I had built an airtight case. But I still had one more thing I needed to do, something that required courage I wasn't entirely sure I possessed. I needed to call Elijah Pierce. I sat at our kitchen table staring at my phone for 10 minutes before I finally pulled up his contact information. Mason had it saved in our shared contacts from all the times we'd coordinated double-date dinners and social gatherings. I'd probably spoken directly to Elijah fewer than a dozen times in all the years I'd known him. He was quiet, reserved, the kind of person who observed more than he participated in conversations. But I'd seen something in his eyes at those gatherings, especially in recent months. A kind of resigned awareness that suggested he knew more than he was saying. The same look I'd probably been wearing myself before I found the concrete evidence. My finger hovered over the call button. Part of me wondered if this was going too far, if I should just let Saturday's confrontation happen without involving him beforehand. But another part of me, the part that had been gaslit and manipulated for months, knew that Elijah deserved the courtesy of a warning. He deserved to know that his world was about to change. I pressed call. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice professional and slightly puzzled. "This is Elijah." "Hi Elijah, it's Aria Montgomery, Mason's wife." I kept my voice steady and neutral. There was a brief pause. "Aria. Oh. Is everything okay? I'm calling because Mason has arranged for me to come to your house on Saturday evening to apologize to Scarlett. He insisted that the apology happen in front of both of you, and I wanted to make sure you'd be home for it." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him processing the layers of meaning beneath my words. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, become more alert and focused. "I'll be there." No questions about what the apology was for, no confusion about why I was calling him directly instead of just letting Mason coordinate everything. Just immediate understanding and agreement. "Thank you," I said quietly. Then, because I needed him to understand what was really happening, I added, "I think there are some things you should know. Things that have been going on that you might have suspected but didn't have proof of." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with recognition. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for calling me." Those 5 words carried the weight of years of suspicion, of being told he was paranoid or overly sensitive, of watching his wife's attention and affection directed toward someone else while being made to feel like the problem for noticing. "You deserve to know the truth," I said. "We both do." "I'll be there Saturday," he repeated. "And Aria? Whatever you're planning to say, I'm ready to hear it." We hung up without saying anything more. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling the weight of what I'd just set in motion. Elijah knew something was coming now. He'd be prepared, alert, watching for the truth I was about to reveal. Meanwhile, Mason came home that evening in an excellent mood. He'd apparently had lunch with Scarlett that day, their regular Tuesday having shifted to Thursday this week for scheduling reasons. He talked enthusiastically about how grateful Scarlett was that I'd agreed to apologize, how much it would mean to her to clear the air, how this would really strengthen all of our relationships moving forward. I nodded and smiled while internally reviewing the evidence I'd compiled. Friday was more of the same. Mason coached me repeatedly on what to say during the apology. He'd actually written out bullet points on his phone that he wanted me to cover. Acknowledge my jealousy. Admit I'd misinterpreted their friendship. Thank Scarlett for her patience with my insecurities. Express gratitude that she'd been willing to give me another chance. He even suggested I bring an expensive bottle of wine as a peace offering. Really show her you're serious about making amends, he said earnestly. I agreed to everything. I practiced the humble facial expressions he suggested. I asked clarifying questions about tone and body language to make him think I was genuinely preparing to deliver the apology he'd scripted. With each coaching session, Mason's confidence grew visibly. His shoulders relaxed. He smiled more easily. He'd successfully trained his wife to perform public submission that would cement his emotional affair partner's permanent priority in his life. Friday evening, he actually hugged me and said he was proud of me for being mature enough to work through my issues. I hugged him back, feeling the unfamiliar weight of deliberate deception. I'd never been good at lying or hiding my feelings. But something had shifted inside me since discovering that hidden folder on his laptop. I'd learned from the master. That night, I lay in bed next to Mason listening to him breathe peacefully, completely unaware that tomorrow would detonate his carefully constructed world. Sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept circling through what I was planning, examining it from every angle, questioning my own motives and methods. Was I becoming vindictive? Was public humiliation really the answer, or was I just hurt and lashing out in the most damaging way I could think of? Did Elijah really deserve to have his marriage destroyed in front of witnesses? Or should I have found a gentler way to tell him the truth? But every time doubt crept in, I remembered specific moments from the past months. Mason's face illuminated by his phone screen at our anniversary dinner while I sat invisible across from him. The disappointed looks he'd given me whenever I tried to set boundaries with Scarlett. The patient, patronizing tone he used when explaining why my discomfort with their relationship was actually my personal failing. The way he'd made me question my own sanity and instincts while maintaining a hidden emotional affair that proved I'd been right all along. I thought about all the women who stay silent because speaking truth makes other people uncomfortable. Who apologize for being right because it's easier than standing firm. Who shoulder blame for other people's betrayals because that's what they've been conditioned to do. And I realized that what I was planning wasn't petty revenge. It was justice, clarity, and the kind of truth-telling that shatters comfortable lies people have been living in for too long. When dawn finally broke through our bedroom window, painting the walls with pale gold light, I got up with absolute certainty. I wasn't nervous anymore. I wasn't second-guessing my decision. I was ready to deliver the apology Mason had demanded, just not the one he'd scripted. Saturday had arrived, and by evening, everyone would finally know the truth. Saturday arrived with clear skies and temperatures that belonged more to early September than late October. I spent the morning moving through our apartment like someone preparing for battle, though Mason interpreted my quiet focus as nervousness about the apology. He kept reassuring me that everything would be fine, that Scarlett was genuinely looking forward to clearing the air, that this evening would mark a new beginning for all of us. I let him believe whatever he needed to believe. By 5 in the afternoon, I was dressed in a simple navy dress that struck the right balance between respectful and understated. Nothing too formal that might suggest I was making a dramatic production out of this. Nothing too casual that might imply I wasn't taking the apology seriously. Mason had picked out the expensive bottle of wine that morning, a French vintage that cost more than we typically spent on a week's worth of groceries. He wrapped it carefully and placed it in a gift bag with tissue paper, treating it like some kind of peace offering that would seal our reconciliation. We left our apartment at 6:15 for the 25-minute drive to Scarlett and Elijah's house. Mason insisted we take his car and arrive together, presenting what he called a united front. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching over to pat my knee in what he probably thought was comforting reassurance. He talked the entire drive about how meaningful this was, how proud he was of me for being mature enough to work through my issues, how our marriage would be stronger once we got past this rough patch. I watched suburban streets slide past the passenger window, brick townhouses and small yards and families out enjoying the unseasonably warm evening. Everything looked so normal, so ordinary. People walking dogs and kids riding bikes and someone washing their car in a driveway. None of them had any idea that in one of those similar-looking houses, for lives were about to detonate in ways that couldn't be put back together. Mason kept glancing at me with this hopeful expression mixed with barely concealed nervousness. Part of him probably wondered if I'd actually go through with the apology he'd scripted or if I'd back out at the last minute and embarrass him. I could see him searching my face for signs of rebellion or resistance, looking for any indication that I might deviate from the performance he'd so carefully choreographed. I gave him nothing. My expression remained neutral, maybe slightly anxious in the way someone might look before an uncomfortable but necessary conversation. I held the wine bag carefully on my lap. I nodded when he talked. I smiled when he squeezed my knee. I was the picture of a contrite wife ready to make amends and move forward. When we pulled up to Scarlett and Elijah's house at exactly 6:40, I noticed all the interior lights were blazing. Through the large front windows I could see into their living room where Scarlett was moving around, arranging something on their coffee table. Even from the car I could tell she'd gone to effort for this occasion, setting the stage for what she believed would be her validation and my public submission. Mason parked in their driveway, turned off the engine and sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel. Then he turned to me with an expression of such genuine emotion that I almost felt sorry for him. "Thank you for doing this," he said quietly. "I know it's not easy, but this means everything to me, Arya. Everything. Our marriage is going to be so much stronger after tonight. You'll see." I looked at my husband, this man who had gaslit me for months while maintaining an emotional affair, who had demanded I apologize to his affair partner for the crime of noticing their inappropriate relationship, who genuinely believed this evening would strengthen our marriage by cementing another woman's permanent priority in his life. "I know it will," I said and squeezed his hand back. That was the last moment Mason would look at me with trust or affection, though he didn't know it yet. We walked up to the front door together, Mason carrying the wine in its gift bag. He rang the doorbell even though through the window we could see Scarlett already heading toward us. She opened the door before the chime finished, her smile wide and barely concealing her smugness. She looked perfect, of course. Designer jeans that probably cost $300, paired with a cream silk blouse that had that effortless elegance expensive clothing always manages to project. Her highlighted hair fell in professionally styled waves. Her makeup was flawless even for a casual Saturday evening at home. She'd clearly dressed for this occasion like someone expecting to be photographed for a lifestyle magazine spread on gracious living. "Mason, Arya, come in." Her voice was warm and welcoming, playing the gracious host receiving guest she was genuinely happy to see. She stepped aside with a flourish, gesturing us into their home. "I'm so glad we're doing this. Really clearing the air will be good for all of us." Mason handed her the wine with a smile. Scarlett made appropriate appreciative noises about the label and vintage, though I noticed she set it aside without much genuine interest. She was focused on me, studying my face and body language, trying to gauge how thoroughly Mason had broken me into compliance. Elijah appeared from the direction of their kitchen, and the moment our eyes met I saw everything I needed to know. He was alert, watchful, braced for impact. His expression had none of the resigned exhaustion I'd seen at previous social gatherings. He knew something significant was about to happen, and unlike Mason and Scarlett, he was prepared for it to be uncomfortable. "Arya." "Mason." He nodded to both of us, his voice neutral and professional. Then his eyes found mine again for just a fraction of a second and I saw acknowledgement there. Recognition. Maybe even gratitude. We all moved into their living room according to some unspoken choreography that felt rehearsed despite none of us having planned it. Scarlett and Elijah settled onto their gray sectional couch, sitting close enough to appear united but with enough space between them that suggested the distance in their marriage. Mason and I took matching armchairs positioned across from them, a glass coffee table creating a barrier between us. The coffee table held wine glasses already poured, a carefully arranged cheese board with what looked like expensive selections from a specialty shop, small plates and napkins positioned just so. Scarlett had clearly spent time staging this scene, creating the perfect setting for receiving an apology that would validate years of boundary violations and inappropriate behavior. The room itself felt theatrical under the bright lighting. Like we were all actors who'd been given scripts, except only I knew what the real plot was about to be. Mason settled into his chair and gave me an encouraging nod. His expression radiated barely contained excitement mixed with relief. He thought he'd won. He'd successfully trained his wife to perform public submission that would cement his emotional affair partner's permanent position in his life while putting his actual wife in her proper place as the lesser priority. Scarlett folded her hands in her lap with gracious expectation, her posture perfect, her expression carefully arranged into magnanimous forgiveness. She was ready to receive my contrition and accept my apology with the kind of generous spirit that would make her look even better in Mason's eyes. Elijah leaned back slightly against the couch cushions, his arms crossed loosely, watching everything with focused intensity. He was the only person in that room besides me who understood that something was about to shift. I took a deliberate breath and set down my wine glass on the coffee table. The sound of glass meeting would seem unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. I looked directly at Scarlett, holding her gaze, and began speaking in a voice that was calm and measured and gave nothing away. Scarlett, I want to start by saying that Mason was absolutely right. I paused, letting those words settle in the room, watching her smile widen slightly with validation. I do owe you an apology. Another pause. Scarlett's posture relaxed fractionally. Mason's face lit up with relief and satisfaction. Elijah's expression didn't change at all, but I saw his eyes sharpen with attention. But not for the reasons you think. The atmosphere in that living room shifted so dramatically I could almost feel the air pressure change. Mason's encouraging smile faltered and froze on his face. Scarlett's expression transformed from gracious acceptance to cautious uncertainty. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his full attention locked on me now, every muscle in his body alert. I continued in that same calm, measured voice, not raising my volume or changing my tone. Just speaking truth with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute certainty. I apologize for staying silent when I should have spoken up years ago. I apologize for allowing you and Mason to continue an emotional affair right under my nose while convincing myself I was the crazy one for feeling uncomfortable. Mason tried to interrupt, his voice sharp with warning. Arya, what are you? I raised my hand, cutting him off mid-sentence without even looking at him. My eyes stayed locked on Scarlett's face, watching her carefully constructed facade begin to crack. Let me finish. You demanded an apology. I'm giving you one. I turned my attention to Elijah, whose face had gone completely still. I pulled out my phone with hands that were steady despite everything, opened the folder I'd so carefully organized over the past days, and began speaking in that same measured tone. I apologized to Elijah actually because he deserved to know the truth about his wife long before tonight. For the past 3 years, Mason and Scarlett have been meeting every Tuesday for secret lunch dates at Riverbend Cafe. They've been having late-night text conversations about alternative life choices they wish they'd made together, about intimate regrets and emotional connections that cross every boundary a married person should respect. I handed my phone directly to Elijah, watching his face as he took it with trembling hands. His eyes moved across the screen, reading the first message, then scrolling to the next, then the next. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like he might be sick. But his hands kept moving, kept scrolling, methodically reviewing every piece of evidence I'd compiled. Mason was on his feet now, his voice rising with panic. Elijah, don't listen to this. She's taking things completely out of context. You know how Arya gets about my friendship with Scarlett. She's always been jealous and now she's trying to destroy. How long? Elijah's voice cut through Mason's explanation like a blade through paper. He didn't raise his volume. He didn't need to. The coldness in those 2 words silenced everything else in the room. He was still looking at my phone, still scrolling through messages, but his question was directed at Scarlett with absolute precision. The room fell into a silence so complete I could hear someone's watch ticking from across the coffee table. Scarlett's mouth opened and closed several times. Her perfectly composed expression had cracked completely now, tears forming in her carefully made-up eyes. She tried the reflexive denial first, her voice shaking. It's not what it looks like. Mason and I are just close friends. We've always been close. There's nothing physical between us. Nothing inappropriate has actually happened. Elijah finally looked up from my phone, and the expression on his face made even me take a step back. It wasn't rage exactly, though that was there. It was something colder and more devastating. Recognition. Vindication. Years of suppressed suspicion finally given permission to surface. I didn't ask if you slept with him, Elijah said, his voice still controlled but carrying an undercurrent of fury that was more frightening than shouting would have been. I asked how long you've been having an emotional affair with Mason while making me feel crazy for noticing. The parallel to my own experience was so perfect it felt orchestrated. We had both been living the same nightmare of gaslighting and manipulation, just from different angles in different marriages. Both told we were paranoid or insecure or unable to handle mature adult friendships. Both made to feel like the problem while our spouses maintained an inappropriate relationship right in front of us. Scarlett's carefully maintained facade shattered completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, ruining her perfect makeup. Elijah, please. You're misunderstanding. We never meant for anything to. 3 years. Elijah's voice was flat now, reading from the timestamps on my phone. According to these messages, this has been going on for at least 3 years. 3 years of secret lunches. 3 years of late-night conversations about regretting your life choices. 3 years of you telling him things you never told me. He scrolled further, his jaw tightening as he read. Here's one from 8 months ago where Scarlett asks Mason if he ever thinks about what life would have been like if you'd gotten together instead of staying friends. And Mason responds that he thinks about it more than he probably should. Mason had found his voice again, but instead of apologizing or acknowledging the truth, he went straight into damage control mode. He was standing now, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation, pointing at me like I was the one who had committed some unforgivable betrayal. Arya, you're destroying everything. This isn't what I meant when I asked you to apologize. You twisted what I asked you to do. You've taken private conversations completely out of context and you're using them as weapons to hurt people who've done nothing wrong. His voice cracked with desperation as he tried to reframe the entire situation, tried to make my truth-telling seem like manipulation or revenge rather than simple honesty. He turned to Elijah with his palms up in a placating gesture, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Look, Elijah, you have to understand. Scarlett and I have been close friends since college. We have history together. Yes, maybe we talk more than typical friends do. Maybe we're more emotionally connected than some people might think is appropriate. But nothing physical has ever happened between us. We've never crossed that line. Arya's jealousy has blown a close friendship completely out of proportion. But Elijah wasn't listening to Mason's revised narrative. He was still scrolling through my phone, reading message after message where Mason and Scarlett crossed boundaries that no amount of explanation could justify. His expression grew colder and more closed with each screen. It says here you bought her a designer scarf for her birthday, Elijah said quietly, reading from the email receipts I'd included. $250. And expensive wine for her promotion. Flowers sent to her office. He looked up at Scarlett. You told me those flowers were from a grateful client. Scarlett's tears were flowing freely now. Elijah, I can explain. How much? Elijah cut her off. How much money has Mason spent on you over the past 3 years while telling me we needed to be more careful with our budget? Mason's attempts to control the narrative were falling apart in real time. The evidence spoke louder than his deflections, and Elijah was clearly someone who trusted facts over explanations. I stood up slowly, smoothing my navy dress and picking up my purse while Mason continued his desperate explanations to an audience that had stopped listening. The time had come for me to leave, to walk away from the explosion I'd detonated and let it burn through whatever was left. I looked at Mason directly, meeting his eyes for what would probably be the last time with any kind of intimacy or connection between us. You demanded I apologize for speaking truth. I just did. You told me to do it in front of Elijah. Done. You threatened me with divorce if I didn't comply. Well, Mason, consider this my answer to that threat. Then I turned to Elijah, whose expression had shifted to something complex. Painful gratitude mixed with devastation. Anger at the betrayal mixed with relief at finally having proof that he wasn't crazy. I've sent you copies of everything to your email address. All the screenshots, all the financial records, all the evidence you need to make informed decisions about your marriage. You deserve to know the truth, and I'm genuinely sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Mason grabbed my arm as I moved toward the door. His grip was tight enough to hurt, his fingers digging into my skin with desperate strength. His voice had shifted from angry to pleading, taking on that desperate quality of someone watching their world collapse and scrambling for any handhold to stop the fall. You can't just walk out. We need to talk about this. Arya, please. You're my wife. We can work through this if you just calm down and be reasonable. I pulled my arm free with more force than I'd intended, leaving red marks where his fingers had been. I met his eyes one final time. No, Mason. You need to talk to your lawyer. Because I'm done being the understanding wife in a three-person marriage where I was always the least important person. I walked toward the door without looking back. Behind me I could hear Scarlett sobbing, her careful composure completely destroyed. I could hear Elijah's cold questions continuing, his voice controlled but carrying that undercurrent of fury. I could hear Mason's increasingly desperate attempts to explain, to justify, to somehow salvage something from the wreckage. But none of it was my problem anymore. I stepped out into the cool October evening air and closed the door behind me, muffling the sounds of their imploding marriages. The suburban street was quiet, peaceful even, completely at odds with the devastation I'd just left behind. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called for a rideshare, my fingers fumbling over the screen. The driver arrived within 10 minutes. I climbed into the back seat and gave him my address, then spent the entire 30-minute drive staring out the window at suburban streets passing by. Houses with lights on and families inside. People living their normal Saturday evenings completely unaware that in one similar-looking house, their lives had just detonated in ways that couldn't be put back together. Part of me wondered if I should feel guilty for the devastation I'd caused. I'd destroyed my own marriage, yes, but I'd also destroyed Scarlett and Elijah's. I'd humiliated Mason and Scarlett publicly. I'd handed Elijah information that would likely haunt him for years. But mostly I felt relieved, like I'd finally stopped carrying a weight I hadn't realized was crushing me for so long. When the rideshare dropped me off at our apartment building, I walked through the lobby and up to our floor feeling like I was moving through a different world than the one I'd left that morning. I unlocked our door and stepped inside, and immediately the space felt different. Lighter somehow. Less suffocating. Mason's things were everywhere. His jacket on the hook by the door. His shoes lined up near the entrance. His laptop still sitting on the desk where I'd discovered everything. But they all felt temporary now, like artifacts from a life that had already ended. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on our couch in the quiet apartment, and let myself feel the full weight of what came next. I sat on that couch nursing my wine and waiting. Part of me wondered if Mason would come home at all that night, or if he'd stay at Scarlett's house trying to salvage what remained of their fantasy relationship now that it had been exposed to harsh reality. But some deeper instinct told me he'd come back, if only to try one more time to control the narrative. His key turned in the lock at 11:47. I'd been watching the clock, noting each passing hour, existing in that strange suspended state between exhaustion and hyper-awareness. The door opened and Mason walked in, and the man who entered our apartment looked nothing like the confident husband who'd left it just 5 hours earlier. His face was ravaged. Eyes red and swollen from what must have been crying, though I'd never seen Mason cry except at our wedding. His hair stood up in places where he'd clearly been running his hands through it repeatedly. His shirt was wrinkled and partially untucked. He looked like someone who'd aged a decade in an evening. He stood in the doorway staring at me for a long moment. Then he closed the door behind him with careful control and walked into the living room. The look on his face was something I'd never seen before. Equal parts devastation and fury, grief and rage, all competing for dominance across his features. "How could you do that?" His voice came out raw, scraped clean of its usual confident tone. "How could you humiliate me like that? Destroy my friendship? Share private conversations that you had no right to see in the first place?" I took another sip of wine and said nothing. I'd said everything that needed saying at Scarlett's house. Now it was Mason's turn to deal with consequences. He started pacing, his movements jerky and agitated. "You violated my privacy. You went through my personal files, read my private messages, and then you weaponized them to hurt people who've done nothing wrong. Do you understand what you've done? You've destroyed 2 marriages because you couldn't handle me having a close friendship." This was the anger phase. I recognized it from articles I'd read about how people respond to being caught in affairs. Deny, deflect, attack. Make the person who discovered the betrayal into the villain. I let him pace and rant for 20 minutes, cycling through accusations about my jealousy and insecurity and inability to trust. Then he shifted strategies, sitting down on the armchair across from me with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together in a posture that suggested vulnerability and remorse. "Look, I know I made mistakes," he said, his voice softer now, more reasonable. "Maybe Scarlett and I got too close. Maybe I didn't set appropriate boundaries. But we can work through this, Arya. We can go to couples therapy. I'll put distance between myself and Scarlett. Whatever you need." Our marriage is worth fighting for. This was the bargaining phase. Promising change, offering concessions, trying to negotiate a path forward that would minimize his losses. I set down my wine glass and looked at him directly. Mason, I'm filing for divorce. His face went through another rapid evolution of expressions. Shock first, as if he genuinely hadn't considered that possibility. Then calculation, probably running through options for damage control. Then manipulation, his features arranging themselves into wounded confusion. You're overreacting, he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd come to know so well. You're emotional right now, understandably. But destroying our marriage over a friendship that you misinterpreted isn't the answer. You're letting your insecurities ruin something good. This is exactly what I was trying to help you work through. And there was. Even now, even caught with irrefutable evidence of his emotional affair, Mason was trying to make this my failing. My insecurity. My misinterpretation. My inability to handle mature adult relationships. I stood up and walked to our bedroom without another word, closing and locking the door behind me. I heard Mason call after me, heard him try the door handle, heard him spend another hour pacing the living room. Around 2 a.m, I heard him finally settle on the couch, probably too exhausted to keep performing. The next morning he tried yet another approach. The wounded husband who just wanted to save his marriage. He called in sick to work and spent the entire day following me around our apartment, trying to initiate conversations about rebuilding trust and moving forward together. But I was done. Done fighting. Done explaining. Done accepting blame for other people's betrayals. On Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd detonated our lives at Scarlett's house, I called Victoria Brennan. I'd gotten her name from a colleague who'd been through a similar situation and spoke highly of her strategic approach to difficult divorces. Victoria had a reputation for being thorough, uncompromising, and completely unsympathetic to spouses who tried to manipulate proceedings through gaslighting and blame shifting. Her office was downtown in one of those modern buildings with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Victoria herself was in her mid-50s, professionally dressed in a way that suggested she took her work seriously. She had sharp eyes that missed nothing and a direct manner that I found immediately reassuring. Our first consultation lasted 2 hours. I showed her everything. The screenshots organized chronologically, the credit card statements showing the pattern of secret lunches, the photos, the email receipts for gifts Mason had bought Scarlett. Victoria reviewed each piece of evidence with focused intensity, occasionally making notes on her tablet, asking clarifying questions about dates and context. When she finished reviewing everything, she sat back in her chair and gave me her assessment with the kind of straightforward honesty I desperately needed. Emotional affairs are harder to prove than physical ones in divorce proceedings, but the documentation you've compiled is exceptionally comprehensive. This shows a clear pattern of deception spanning years, financial evidence of resources being diverted outside the marriage, and communication that crosses appropriate boundaries. We can absolutely use this. She laid out her recommended strategy. File for divorce on grounds of marital misconduct based on emotional infidelity. Push for a favorable settlement given Mason's documented pattern of deception and the emotional harm it had caused. Be prepared for Mason to claim I'd violated his privacy by accessing his laptop, but counter that I'd discovered the evidence accidentally while using his computer for legitimate work purposes, and that the content of what I found justified further investigation. He'll try to make you the villain, Victoria said with the confidence of someone who'd seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times. He'll claim you're jealous, vindictive, unable to handle his having friendships. He'll try to reframe his emotional affair as innocent closeness that you misinterpreted. Don't let him. The evidence speaks for itself. I hired her on the spot. 2 weeks after the explosive apology at Scarlett's house, I received an email that surprised me. The sender was Elijah Pierce and the subject line was simply, "Thank you." I opened it with curiosity mixed with apprehension. The message explained that Elijah had filed for divorce the Monday after our confrontation, armed with the evidence I'd provided. He wrote about years of suspecting something was wrong but convincing himself he was being paranoid, that Scarlett's friendship with Mason was innocent even when his gut screamed otherwise. My apology had given him both validation and proof. The evidence I'd compiled had made it impossible for Scarlett to deny or minimize what had been happening. He asked if we could meet for coffee sometime, carefully clarifying that it wasn't anything romantic or complicated. He just wanted to talk with someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be the third priority in your own marriage, to be gaslit into doubting your own perceptions while your spouse maintained an inappropriate relationship right in front of you. I agreed to meet him, curious about this quiet man I'd barely known despite years of forced social gatherings at couple events. We met at a small cafe downtown on a Wednesday afternoon. Elijah looked different than I'd ever seen him. The resigned exhaustion that had always characterized his expression at parties was gone, replaced by something more solid and present. He looked like someone who'd finally stopped carrying a weight he'd been bearing for too long. Our conversation flowed easily in ways I hadn't expected. There was no need for pretense or performance. We'd both already seen each other at our worst moments, had both been publicly humiliated in the same living room, had both discovered that our instincts had been right all along. Elijah told me about years of watching Scarlett's face light up when Mason called or texted. About expressing discomfort with their friendship and being told he was too sensitive, too jealous, unable to handle mature adult relationships. About the slow erosion of trust that happens when someone constantly makes you doubt your own perceptions while maintaining that you're the one with the problem. It was like listening to my own experiences reflected back at me from a different angle. We'd been living parallel nightmares in our respective marriages, both manipulated and gaslit by people who claimed to love us while prioritizing their emotional affair. Through mutual friends and occasional social media observation over the following months, I learned that Mason and Scarlett tried to make a real relationship work after both divorces were set in motion. The predictability of it was almost funny. Once their connection was no longer forbidden or secret, once they had to deal with actual relationship logistics instead of stolen emotional moments and late-night texts, the fantasy collapsed under the weight of mundane reality. They lasted exactly 4 months. Mutual friends reported growing tensions almost immediately. Scarlett apparently struggled with Mason's financial situation after divorce settlements left him stretched thin. Mason discovered that Scarlett's constant need for attention and validation, which had seemed endearing when directed at him from a distance through carefully curated messages, became exhausting when it was his full-time responsibility to manage. The relationship that had seemed so special and deep when conducted through text messages and secret lunches turned out to be mostly illusion when forced into daily existence. They broke up quietly without the dramatic explosion that had marked the end of their marriages. Just a sad fizzle that proved what I'd suspected all along: what they had wasn't love or deep connection. It was the thrill of emotional affairs and the validation of being someone's secret priority. The knowledge that Mason and Scarlett's relationship had imploded so spectacularly after everything they'd risked gave me a strange sense of closure. Not satisfaction exactly, though there was an element of vindication. More like confirmation that my instincts had been correct all along. What they'd had wasn't the deep, transcendent connection Mason had defended so fiercely. It was fantasy and escapism dressed up as friendship, and it couldn't survive exposure to ordinary reality. 6 months after that explosive Saturday night at Scarlett's house, I sat in Victoria's downtown office signing the final divorce papers. The afternoon sun streamed through those floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished conference table where documents lay spread out in neat stacks. Victoria had negotiated a settlement that was more favorable than I'd expected. Mason agreed to split our savings evenly, let me keep the apartment since the lease was in my name alone, and even pay half my legal fees. Victoria suspected his unusual generosity stemmed from wanting to end proceedings quickly before more details of his relationship with Scarlett became public record. His colleagues and family were already asking uncomfortable questions about why his marriage had ended. Prolonging the divorce would only invite more scrutiny he couldn't afford. I signed my name on page after page, watching my signature legally transform me back into just Aria Montgomery. No hyphenated name. No legal ties to Mason remaining except these final documents that would be filed away in some courthouse archive. Each signature felt like closing a door that I'd been trying to shut for months but kept getting wedged open by Mason's attempts at reconciliation and manipulation. When I signed the last page, Victoria smiled and extended her hand. "Congratulations. You're officially divorced." I shook her hand, gathered my copies of the paperwork, and walked out of her office carrying a folder that officially ended one chapter of my life and began another. I'd expected this moment to feel heavier, sadder. I'd expected at least some echo of grief for the marriage I'd believed in, the future I'd planned, the love I'd thought we shared. Instead, I felt lighter than I had in years. Like I'd finally removed a heavy winter coat I'd been wearing for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to move freely. The afternoon sun seemed brighter as I walked to my car, warmer on my skin, carrying the kind of promise that comes with genuine new beginnings. My weekly coffee meetings with Elijah had continued throughout the divorce proceedings. What started as mutual support between two people who'd survived similar betrayals gradually evolved into something more complicated and interesting. We met every Wednesday afternoon at the same downtown cafe, a small place with mismatched furniture and local artwork on the walls. At first, our conversations centered on processing the trauma we'd experienced. We compared notes on gaslighting tactics our spouses had used, traded stories about red flags we'd ignored, and found comfort in being understood by someone who'd lived through the same specific nightmare. But somewhere around the third month, I noticed our conversations shifting. We talked less about past pain and more about present lives and future possibilities. Elijah mentioned a promotion at his accounting firm that came with new responsibilities he found genuinely exciting. I talked about a freelance design client who gave me creative freedom I hadn't experienced in years, letting me experiment with concepts I'd been too cautious to try before. We discovered shared interests that had nothing to do with our failed marriages. We both loved old black and white films from the 40s and 50s, the kind with clever dialogue and cinematography that felt like art. We both preferred hiking trails that were slightly difficult to find, the ones that required research and effort but rewarded you with solitude and views that more popular trails couldn't offer. We both appreciated quiet mornings where silence felt comfortable instead of awkward, where you didn't need to fill every moment with conversation. One Wednesday afternoon in early spring, Elijah suggested we meet for dinner instead of coffee. Something about the way he asked made it clear this was a different kind of invitation, a shift from friendly support to something more intentional. "There's a new Italian place that opened downtown," he said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness I found endearing. "I thought maybe we could try it together. If you're interested." I looked at this quiet man who'd survived the same betrayal I had, who understood without explanation what it felt like to be gaslit and manipulated by someone you trusted. We were both gun-shy about jumping into anything serious, both carrying damage that would take time to heal. But we'd built something honest between us over these months of Wednesday afternoon conversations. A foundation based on truth instead of illusion, on genuine understanding instead of fantasy. "I'd like that," I said. We took things slowly, both aware that trust rebuilds gradually after being thoroughly demolished. But the foundation felt different this time. Solid in ways my marriage to Mason never had been. I ran into Mason unexpectedly on a Saturday afternoon about 8 months after our divorce was finalized. I was in the grocery store produce section, reaching for a bag of organic apples, when another hand reached for the same bag at exactly the same moment. We both pulled back, started to apologize, then recognized each other. Mason looked different than the last time I'd seen him. Older, somehow more worn. New lines had formed around his eyes and mouth, the kind that come from stress and difficult realizations rather than laughter. His hair had more gray in it. He'd lost weight, but not in a healthy way, more like he'd stopped caring about regular meals. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, both of us holding vegetables we no longer wanted, neither sure what the protocol was for unexpected encounters with ex-spouses in produce sections. "Arya," he said finally. "How are you?" I kept my answer simple and honest. "I'm good. Working on some interesting design projects. Enjoying the apartment. Building a life that feels right." Mason nodded, something that might have been genuine happiness crossing his face. "I'm glad you're doing well." He looked like he wanted to say something more significant, wrestling with words that wouldn't quite form. Finally, he spoke quietly, almost too soft for me to hear over the ambient grocery store noise. "I made mistakes. A lot of them. I handled our marriage poorly. I wish I'd listened when you tried to tell me the truth about my relationship with Scarlett." The apology was real, I could hear that. But it came far too late to change anything between us. Some things can't be unsaid, some damage can't be undone. I appreciated the acknowledgement but felt nothing beyond that. No anger anymore. No hurt. Just recognition that this was a person I used to know who taught me important lessons about boundaries and self-trust. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. There was a pause. Then I asked because some part of me was curious about how their story ended. "How's Scarlett?" Mason's expression closed off immediately, his face shutting down in a way that told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. We broke up months ago. Turns out what we had didn't translate well into an actual relationship once it wasn't secret anymore. He laughed without humor. I'm living in a studio apartment across town, working through my own process of figuring out who I am outside the fantasy I'd been maintaining. We parted cordially after that, both of us aware that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. They can only be acknowledged as part of the landscape that shaped us into whoever we become next. Today I live in an apartment that no longer carries any trace of Mason or our marriage. I redecorated completely after the divorce finalized, erasing visual reminders and replacing them with choices that reflect only my taste and preferences. The bookshelves hold novels I actually want to read rather than impressive titles Mason thought we should display. The walls feature artwork from local artists whose work speaks to me rather than pieces chosen to impress dinner guests. The furniture is arranged for my comfort and daily life rather than entertaining couples I never wanted to host. The silence here isn't lonely. It's peaceful. The sound of a life reclaimed, of boundaries respected, of truth spoken without apology. Elijah and I are still taking things slow, still rebuilding trust that was demolished in our previous marriages. But what we're building feels different this time. Honest instead of performed. Based on respect instead of manipulation. Built between two people who understand the value of truth because we both paid the price for living in lies. I think about that night sometimes. That explosive apology that detonated multiple lives in Scarlett's carefully staged living room. Part of me still wonders if I could have handled it differently, more privately, with less public devastation for everyone involved. But mostly I understand that some truths need to be spoken loudly. They need to be witnessed by everyone who's been affected by the lies. Mason wanted me to kneel and apologize for hurting Scarlett's feelings. I gave him exactly what he demanded. I just made sure the apology revealed every uncomfortable truth he'd been working so hard to hide. The moral crystallized clearly over these months of rebuilding. Never force an apology from a woman who speaks truth. Because women like me don't apologize for seeing clearly. We apologize for staying silent too long. And when we finally speak, we burn down every carefully constructed lie. Mason learned too late that forcing someone to apologize is only a victory if you control what they're apologizing for. I didn't bow for truth. I weaponized it. And in doing so, I reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to pretend anymore. The silence I live in now isn't the silence of submission. It's the silence of peace that comes after you finally stop carrying other people's lies and start living in the clear, bright light of your own truth. If this story of calculated truth and powerful revenge had you completely captivated, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Arya knelt down as if to deliver a humble apology, then revealed every hidden truth about Mason and Scarlett's emotional affair in front of both spouses. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more compelling stories of justice and truth like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.